All right, everyone. What a great start to the day, right? But we have more to come. So let's start to talk about how we start to really use those digital learning technologies that we're now making available effectively. I'm going to hand this over to our learning engineering panel, and our session chair for that is Dr. Angie Gamble. She's going to be moderating the next session. Dr. Gamble is a DoD Army civilian, and she's been working with DoD for over 15 years, since 2005 in the training and education space. Angie leads the Science and Technology Initiatives for the Training Systems and Integration Directorate under the Combined Arms Center Training and Doctrine Command in Fort Eustis, Virginia. So, Angie, over to you to introduce our next panel.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Schatz, for the introduction. Hello and welcome to the Learning Engineering panel. Doctors Chris Dede and John Richards will be the panelist speakers for this session of iFEST 2020. Before we get started, if you have any questions you would like to ask, please submit your questions in the chat box, and at the end of the panelist discussion, we will have time to answer as many questions as time permits. Remaining questions that we did not have time to address will be posted on the panel's page on the conference website for your viewing. Without further delay, I am honored to introduce Drs. Dede and Richards. Dr. Dede and Richards are professors at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. They have co-authored the book, The 60-Year Curriculum, New Models for Lifelong Learning in the Digital Economy. Dr. Dede is the Timothy E. Roth Professor in Learning Technologies at Harvard Graduate School of Education. His fields of scholarship include emerging technologies, policy, and leadership. In 2007, he was honored by Harvard University as an outstanding teacher, and in 2011, he was named a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. His recent co-edited books include Virtual, Augmented, and Mixed Realities in Education, Learning Engineer for Online Education, Theoretical Context, and Design-Based Examples. Dr. Richards is a senior executive in education technology and media with extensive experience in business development and strategic planning. He is a recognized leader in emerging media and technology with educational needs and has designed and published award-winning educational materials in mathematics, science, and social studies. Current research interests include entrepreneurship in the education technology marketplace, digital media, literacy, and extensions of the university to support lifelong learning. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Drs. Dede and Richards.
Well, Dr. Gamble, thank you so much for the kind words. In my work at Harvard, in my research in particular, I've worked extensively over 3 decades with immersive learning, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, all the different forms of XR. And I have benefited greatly by my interactions with the many people in the Department of Defense who have been leaders in this field. The Department of Defense has really moved forward immersive learning in many respects. Periodically in that, I would go to the ITSEC conference, and in fact, I was at the 2018 ITSEC conference as part of a panel on learning engineering, and the 2019 ITSEC conference on a panel as part of the Modernizing Learning publication that led to a lot of the ecosystem concepts that our keynote speaker discussed. So I feel very honored and excited to be able to share ideas with you this morning. John?
Hi, I'm John Richards, and I too have been at ITSEC, although I was there in the early 90s while I was at Bolt Baranek and Newman, and we were talking about this crazy new thing called the internet and how it could be used for education. And at ITSEC, we did a demonstration of a world band where we had students at Ramstein, Fort Knox, and in Korea playing music together over the internet, such as it was at the time. Great fun, and it was about that time that I realized the world really was flat. Chris?
So John's going to begin by giving us a big picture of what the talk is about, and then I will shift and talk about learning engineering is the first theme that we want to get into.
Next slide. So the topic is using big data to engineer lifelong learning, which is really putting together three concepts that our keynote speaker we're talking about. Next slide. There's big data, which is what drives things, learning engineering, which is how we manipulate it, and lifelong learning is really the goal for what we're doing. Next.
So John and I co-edited a book on learning engineering for online education, and I have to say that I occasionally get emails asking about my expertise in teaching engineering and how should engineers really be prepared. Next slide. So I always have to explain that actually the book is about engineering learning. It has the name that it does because Herb Simon at Carnegie Mellon over half a century ago developed the concept, and it's a measure of the pace of change in universities that it's taken half a century now for us to be talking about it. But again, here, the Department of Defense is well ahead of many universities, and it's been exciting for me to share ideas with people who are involved with this area. Next slide. So the third editor on the book was Bror Saxberg, who has been a key champion of learning engineering in the modern era, and who was at Kaplan when the book was published. And he had done extensive work with Kaplan's online courses, taking existing courses that were okay, but not great, looking at ways that learning sciences and modernizing learning principles might be brought into them. Next slide. And then redesigning the courses so that they incorporated those principles. But of course, you want to know whenever you're making changes, which changes matter and whether or not the changes are getting you to where you want to be. So the principle of learning engineering was that you could make small changes with a randomized set of the students online unobtrusively, and then you could see how the changes fared. Next slide. And it's important to emphasize how rapidly this can take place, that you can do change, adapt, change, adapt, change, adapt. And this is not the classic research where you're trying to figure out what's best, because what's best is one size fits all, and we know that that's never best. This is doing what our keynote speaker was talking about, personalization, what works when for whom. And the pandemic is certainly a terrible human tragedy, but it has given us the opportunity to move into remote learning at a scale that makes learning engineering quite powerful. So there's a silver lining to that particular dark cloud. Next slide. So Kaplan's model of learning engineering, which is the model of learning engineering in general, and including as it's practiced by the Department of Defense, deals with the agility that the keynote speaker talked about. Design and development based on learning science principles, random assignment to be able to do unbiased experiments, and agile improvement and updating. And it's important to recognize that all of this not only is not possible at the same level in face-to-face courses, but the distance learning courses can accomplish things that face-to-face courses cannot. Many people have no difficulty believing that you there are things that distance education lacks, but it's harder to get them to realize that there are things that face-to-face education lacks. And distance learning is not an inferior apple if face-to-face education is an apple. It's an orange. And the orange has its own kinds of benefits. And learning engineering is a powerful way of realizing those benefits. John, I'll toss it back to you.
Next slide. So there are many factors that are changing the way we see the world. And one of the interesting things to point out is that this book was completed before anything having to do with the virus was found. So we looked at were, click please, the impact of the environment, global warming, the economic issues of globalization, that spry human longevity, and technical digitalization. Now, we're all familiar with digitization, which is the notion of moving from whatever medium you have into a digital medium. But the notion of digitalization is the full impact of changing the way we operate based on the availability of digital materials. And it's forcing us to continually adapt. Click, please. And what we're now wanting to ask is, how does training adapt to this new world that we're seeing? And part of what we wanted to consider was to see this within the context of the impact on training. Next. So the book that has just come out, the 60-year curriculum, is looking literally at the impact of these changes on how we have to operate. As the keynote speaker pointed out, there are 40,000 new jobs for people within the military every year that they have to be trained and upskilled. Well, what that means when you think about it is that we are no longer a one career world. Next.
So where does the 60 years come from? Well, one of the big changes that's taking place is the children that are born now, despite things like the pandemic, are typically going to live into their 90s or beyond. And that means that they're going to have to work until their mid-70s in order to not outlive their money. I personally understand what that's like. And so that's a 60-year period from mid-adolescence until your mid-70s. Those 60 years are going to be a very disruptive and turbulent time. And remember, the book was written before the pandemic, so this isn't 2020 hindsight. And John outlined some of the major factors that are going to make this next half century dangerous and turbulent, which means that we need people who are very good at thriving on ambiguity, who are delighted by the opportunity to do transformation rather than threatened by major changes in the world as it's happening. Some of this is disruption, but some of this is advances in technology. There are many technologies in the lab today that are going to dramatically change every aspect of work and citizenship and life. And they're going to be implemented much more rapidly than in the past, because we literally have billions of people with powerful mobile devices, with access to the internet, with social media to share and collaborate and create together. And it's just going to drive everything at an incredible rate. Next slide.
So typically, we've prepared somebody for a career. And this is the critical role of formal education. So we have K-12, you go to a 2 to 4 year college, perhaps even get a master's or a doctorate. And your first career has your professional certification, you may get ongoing professional development, even executive education, click. And there's a design, a purpose for this career planning where we've thought about what's the structure of this learning? And can we provide some coaching for someone as they begin to enter the field? But the problem is, next, that the person leaving this field has a whole set of skills and competencies. Next. And the real issue is we're no longer planning for one career. We're planning for 3, 4 careers in our lifetime. Next. And so that talks to us about how we have to plan to create a context for the second career. And you'll notice the person is bringing some expertise that they gathered in their first career, but we may have to continue doing professional certification. We may have to continue with a new master's or executive ed. And so what we're looking at is a constant relearning. And again, if you think about this, next, we want to now think about how do you offer the flow from a first career to a second career. When a person is changing careers like that, keeping track with, for example, the tracking system that the keynote speaker talked about is an excellent start. But we have to think about also how this has changed the nature of the curriculum itself and what we're teaching. And we have to think about the role of coaching when you've moved from one career to a second career that your original coach had no context for, no knowledge about at all. Next. And then the whole thing goes again when you go to a third career. So this is talking a lot about who you are, how your educational experience has to move in a new direction, because you weren't just planning to be an X. You now have to have that flexibility Chris talked about, and you have to have the ability to learn through your lifetime. Next. So what is the role of training providers in this 60YC talent management? How does each training provider determine which segments of learners it serves? Next. In particular, the key question is, what does it mean to offer the flow and to provide 60-year coaching when we're thinking about multiple careers and multiple learning experiences? Next. It means there's a 60-year curriculum which we have to redefine. We're actually rethinking not just what the overall goal would be, that you take this course and then that course, but actually start thinking about how do we change courses so that when you're learning, you're also being prepared for the changes. Next.
So the National Research Council in 2012 produced a report called Education for Life and Work in the 21st Century that has a lot of relevance. And we made a little matrix out of some of the ideas in that report that cluster into 3 columns: cognitive outcomes, which of course we're very familiar with in training; interpersonal outcomes, which only now are getting increased emphasis; and then intrapersonal outcomes or personal dispositions, which have really been undervalued, but which are highlighted in the report. So if you take the range of educational experiences that people have, you can map those experiences into this kind of a matrix, and you can ask, how much emphasis does each cell get? And typically the result of that is that we're over-investing in a lot of the cognitive areas where the half-life of the knowledge may be short in a time of turbulence anyway, and we're under-investing in areas like the intrapersonal or the interpersonal, where the stresses of disruption induce increased need for those areas. Also, too often we find ourselves thinking about roles and defining ourselves in terms of roles. And yet, as John is pointing out, when you start thinking about having a series of careers, then you end up thinking about not yourself as a role, I'm a college professor, but thinking about yourself as a suite of skills. I'm good at explaining complicated things to a wide variety of people. I'm good at listening carefully and then providing mentoring. I have a lot of social capital. I can pick up the phone and call lots of people and connect people. And when I define myself that way, if somehow Harvard were to go bankrupt tomorrow morning and I was out on the street looking for work, I have a lot broader range of ways of thinking about what I could do than just saying, well, I'd better find another job as a faculty member. Increasingly, some of the visions of the future of higher education are emphasizing this. For example, Georgia Tech is talking about not having students declare a subject area major, but instead having them declare a lifelong passion, our goal. So my younger daughter really has a passion for improving the lives of marginalized populations in global South countries. She's starting with the role of engineering, which is of course a key factor, but she's going to be looking at other careers and other roles as well. And certainly in the military, knowing that some people at least will make a transition to civilian life, it's really important to know this as we start to think about orchestrating these roles. Next slide. So the 60-year curriculum is fundamentally about redefining lifelong learning, which is a theme that the keynote speaker highlighted. We've thought of lifelong learning in the past as episodic and as having parts that are disconnected. And now we need to think about lifelong learning as continuous upskilling. Even when you're not changing a job or a career, you need to be continuously upskilling. And that really contrasts, as John has pointed out, with the focus on current formal educational and training systems as all on a particular job rather than as a pipeline. I have graduate students who come into my office and say, I don't know what to do, Chris. Part of me wants to be a designer and part of me wants to be a researcher. And I say, well, you're going to be both. And probably 3 or 4 other things that neither you or I know what they are. So the real question is, which comes first? Which is the best foundation for what comes next? The military and the Department of Defense, again, have been leaders in some of the most important aspects that we stress in the 60-year curriculum, which deal with dispositions and social emotional learning. If people are going to face an incredibly turbulent half century, they're going to need a lot of dispositions for transformation, for innovation, for seeing an opportunity in uncertainty and ambiguity. Actually, the time in history, recent history, that's most comparable is between 1910 and 1950 or 60, 2 world wars, a pandemic, a Great Depression, the beginning of a very difficult period of conflict between capitalism and communism. The greatest generation is how we talk about them. We're going to need another greatest generation. And the question is, how do we prepare them for that? John?
And part of the main issue that comes out of this is that we actually need to think about education writ large in new ways. This isn't just about thinking, how can I make this experience for this person? It really is about coming up with new models for education that emphasize the flexibility, resilience, confidence that we're deciding needs to be there for lifelong series of careers. Next. Next slide. Yeah, so the traditional factory model of education or office model that we saw in the 1980s yielded a single career person. It was training you to do something. What we're now thinking about is what we're calling a network model, where the nature of work isn't knowledge work per se or manufacturing, but it's consulting, it's entrepreneurship. And the student is thought of as a consultant or an entrepreneur. And the model for a brain isn't a warehouse or a process, it's an agile network. And what we're trying to teach are transferable skills. Next. So the unit isn't just a team, it's a dynamic team. The team you're working with this hour may be very different from the team you're working with in the next hour. And what you're thinking about in terms of the content is the project deliverable. The teacher now becomes a mentor, a coach, an advice resource. And what we're looking at in terms of assessment is moving from a test where you're doing multiple choice or even authentic assessment to performance, a deliverable. And what we're trying to do in pedagogy is empower the student. Next.
So we don't have time to go into a lot of the devil in the details of all of this. And we don't have time to talk about the important role of technology fully, but we can say a few things about implementation. The keynote speaker talked a lot about artificial intelligence. There's no question that the division of labor between people and machines in general is changing, and machines are taking over more and more some of the parts of work that are routine, some of the parts of work that machines can do better than people. And when that happens, there's two things that can happen to the person. If the person doesn't increase their skills, the job becomes de-skilled because the machine is taking a lot of it over. And you have AI, where you're working for some kind of machine intelligence. On the other hand, if the person upskills and says, okay, the simple parts of the job are being done by the machine, now I can focus more on creativity and entrepreneurship because I'm not responsible for that stuff. You have IA, intelligence augmentation, doing what the machine can't do. And it's important to recognize that just as we must prepare people for that kind of a shift in the division of labor and other roles, we have to be prepared ourselves for shifts in that division of labor as instructors and trainers. So Ashok Goel, one of the chapter authors in our learning engineering book and someone who's been involved with the 60-year curriculum, builds different kinds of AI-based assistants that help with instruction. And again, the teacher can be de-skilled or upskilled depending on how we respond to these. So watching how AI is shifting the nature of what teachers do is an important theme. Next slide. Another technology that we wanted to highlight in the very limited time we have available deals with the fact that as we've been discussing, we're not going to go back to completely face-to-face teaching. We're going to be looking at blended and hybrid models. And one of the innovations at Harvard's School of Continuing Education is a platform called Helix. And Helix allows a face-to-face instructor to involve students in the same class at a distance much more effectively than we've seen historically, so that everyone feels as if they're an equal active participant in the class, whether they're actually sitting in the classroom or not. This is a really important advance that we need to look at, and whether it's Helix or whether it's some other system that effectively reaches the same goal, we're going to need to look at how to make hybrid learning more valuable and not just giving people a binary choice between face-to-face and online. Next slide. I think it's important to recognize where we are in history in terms of understanding learning. And this gets back to the emphasis on data that the keynote speaker emphasized. Historically, the microscope captured a kind of data that had always been there, but we didn't know how to collect it. When we collected it, we didn't know how to analyze it. And when we figured out how to analyze it, it changed everything. The disease theory came out of the insights from the microscope. The telescope is the same story. The data were always there, didn't know how to collect them, didn't know how to analyze them. When we finally figured that out, it transformed everything. We now have, with technologies like learning engineering and with platforms like online learning and with points of view and processes like the 60-year curriculum, we have the opportunity to do the same thing for learning. We have the microscope and the telescope for learning. The data have always been there, but we haven't been able to collect them. We're still learning how to analyze them. And we believe that when we succeed, it's going to change everything in terms of how we understand learning, instruction, and training. John?
Next slide. So two other of the chapter authors, one from Columbia University, Jason Wingard and Christine Ferrugia, and also from Arizona State, Punya Mishra and Jacqueline Smith, look at examples in those two universities where they are collaborating with businesses, and that joint business university collaboration gives you the kind of entrepreneurship and gig economy mentality that we think is very important to moving to this new model of education. Next. So we've dealt with big data, engineering learning, and lifelong learning. And I think the intersection of these as we move ahead really are together changing how we're thinking about education generally. We've included our emails here, so feel free to follow up and if you have other questions, but we also have some time now.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dede and Dr. Richards, for that presentation. You're giving us a lot to think about as we navigate through the changes in learning and adjust to new ways of how we learn and train. And we do have a few questions. So I will go with the first question. COVID fits well in your narrative on ongoing disruptions and reinventions. Do you think the increased transition to online education that COVID has sparked will continue? How do you see it affecting military training and education in the future?
So actually, for more than a decade, there's been a lot of research evidence that good face-to-face teaching is effective, good online teaching is effective, but in a different way. And hybrid or blended learning is significantly more effective, done well, than either face-to-face only or online only. So the evidence has been there, but the impetus, the necessity of moving to online learning is what's finally unlocked the door to being able to act on this. And I think that we're seeing the value of online learning, asynchronous learning for people who may think more slowly or for whom English isn't the primary language. Synchronous online learning for people who may be shy, but who find their voice when they're not in a face-to-face situation. And my hope, our hope is that when things return, perhaps never to the normal that they were before, but at least to something less unusual than what we're seeing now, that we will build on this knowledge and evidence about hybrid or blended learning rather than just reverting to face-to-face learning.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Dede. Okay, the second question is, can you talk a little more about what educational institutions are doing to meet the 60-year curriculum challenge and what it means for people in the workforce today?
Well, I think a lot of what's happening in terms of when we looked around is happening in divisions of continuing education.
Mhm.
This tends to fall outside of the normal functioning of a university. And I think some of this is because these have always been a lot more flexible and a lot more open to change. There's a saying around Harvard area that you can always tell a Harvard professor, but you can't tell them much. And as a result, the ability to change education beginning at the departments is probably going to be a very, very long and tough road to hoe. But I think what we're seeing is online education that has emanated from the divisions of continuing ed have been very open to thinking this way.
Yeah, the divisions of continuing education, the community colleges, but to match John's saying, there's another saying that it's harder to change a university than to move a cemetery, even though the two involve similar skills.
Mm-hmm.
And it is difficult. And the leadership of the Department of Defense and the military is really crucial here, because the fact of the matter is the military is ahead of the game now compared to most universities, especially the higher education part as opposed to the continuing education part. Ahead of them in learning engineering, ahead of them in simulation and XR, ahead of them in thinking about the themes that we've discussed. And hopefully we can learn from you.
All right, thank you both for your answers. And one other question is actually it spins off the fact we just finished talking about the military. For those currently serving in the military, what do you see as the biggest challenge to transition their military experience and expertise to the civilian world? And what do you recommend to overcome this challenge?
Well, to me, one of the pieces of research that we found that was really important is the notion of being able to actually understand the skills and competencies that you have. There was some work, a graduate student of ours who was at Stanford came up with a skills analysis that really looks deeper at who you are. If you think of yourself as I'm a logistics person, then you're not aware of all the different skills that go into that career and how that might then be applicable to many other careers. And so part of the real challenge is beginning to unpack what it is that you actually know and are capable of. Chris?
You know, the Modernizing Learning report, which I was involved with peripherally, is a wonderful blueprint for how to move in this direction. And as John is saying, the biggest challenge may be just helping people to become flexible in their own understanding of who they are and what they're capable of doing. And civilian employers often are not good at recognizing this. So as someone who is moving from military to civilian life, it's important for the person to be able to understand what they can do and to be able to explain that. I tell my students that the most important thing that they develop in their work at Harvard is a portfolio. It's great to have a Harvard transcript. It's nice to have letters of recommendation, but at the end of the day, employers want to see the portfolio about what you can do. And I think one thing that DoD could do to help with the transition is to help people, even when they're in DoD, to develop a portfolio that doesn't violate any classified information. that demonstrates the kind of powerful skills that people come out with.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and this one is reference to your book. What are some takeaways from your book, The 60-Year Curriculum, New Models for Lifelong Learning in a Digital Economy, you would like the attendees to put in their toolkit?
Well, I would argue that the notion that we are training people to be more malleable, to live in a gig economy, to be a consultant, even when you've got a steady job. But what's happening is the notion that you need to be flexible. Although I would also add, the book makes a terrific holiday gift. So you could share that with all of your family.
That's right. And John and I are happy to show up next to the Christmas tree for the right amount of money and talk about it. But seriously, John is right that the dispositions are the most important thing. And we need to graduate, if you will, from our educational and training experiences, people of every age who say to themselves, the world is changing and I can really make a difference now. I'm not painted into a corner by the bureaucracy and the established procedures and the dead hand of the past and the compliance mentality of the present. It's back to the Wild West, and I can really make a difference. I can invent things. We need to move from command and control to distributed leadership. There's a lot of things that can happen now, but they depend on a person having the willingness and the excitement to take advantage of them.
Okay, well, thank you again, Dr. Richards and Dr. Dede. We're going to wrap up the sessions here on learning engineering, and we're going to move forward into having a break. But if you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask or think of later, please visit the Learning Engineering panel page on the conference website, and a recording of today's session will be posted, and you may leave comments or questions for Drs. Dede and Richards. And unless Dr. Dede, Richard, if you all have any last parting words you want to give to the attendees, we will move toward break time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.
Yes. All right. So now we will go into our 15-minute break or so. You have a few more minutes, a 13-minute break, I would say, and then return at 1 o'clock. And thank you again for attending this panel discussion on learning engineering.